Thanks for the invitation to talk about this. In 2003, we at least had, the pretense of a national debate case being made to the UN Security Council and to Congress. Whether, in hindsight, obviously, the case that was presented was false. There were no weapons of mass destruction. In the case of Iran, there is very clearly a vast nuclear program, and there is a vast ballistic missile program. However, we have not gone through the national conversation in Congress, never mind the international conversation at the Security Council about what appears to be,
right.
An imminent threat.
Okay. Well, let me cut you off because I want to get this in before Paul jumps in with a set of intelligent questions. Jonathan Tirone, is this effort from your research coming off one desk at the White House, or are our normal intelligence apparatus at least involved at the Pentagon and at Langley?
Look, we were trying to do what every journalist should be doing, and that is to show and not tell. So, journalists these days have a lot of tools at their disposal we didn't have in 2003, and that includes satellite imagery. So the satellite imagery that we're looking at in today's story, I'm sure there are thousands of people in the Pentagon and in other three-letter agencies in the federal government that have even better access than we do. So yes, there are undoubtedly lots of intelligence professionals who have this information, whether it's getting to the White House, the people making the decisions about military action. That's an open question. What we see is, contrary to suggestions by the Trump White House a couple of days ago that this would be an easy operation, we see this would be quite a challenging operation for a number of reasons I'm happy to get into.
Jonathan, we have one carrier group in theater now, another one in transit, but I'm looking at your reporting today, and it makes really clear the challenges. You say U.S. air power can destroy buildings, but it cannot eliminate scientific expertise, stockpiled material, or the political will to rebuild here. What is a reasonable expectation for a military intervention into Iran at this point, do you think?
Well, it really depends on the objectives. Trump said a couple of days ago at the State of the Union that there are indications, we confirmed that indeed the nuclear program is active. We have not accounted for the very large stockpile of enriched uranium for more than 8 months. That in itself is shocking by any measure. If the objective of a potential strike is to include the ballistic missile program, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of discrete hardened sites spread over thousands of square kilometers across the entire country. We're talking about redundant installations making propellants and fuel, and explosives. So you're talking about not just the very targeted strike that we witnessed in June, where these B-2 bombers dropped the massive ordnance on these two specific sites. We're talking about a very spread out operation that could last weeks potentially. And then we get into this conversation that we've seen over the last several years about supply chains and armaments, ordinances. How much do we have in the stockpile? How quickly can we manufacture and get additional ordnance into the theater? So, I mean, this is a potentially very complex situation.
We continue with Jonathan Tirone of Bloomberg, expert on nuclear warfare and the instruments of it. Jonathan, Paul and I, we're like, Jonathan Tirone, Vienna, Austria.
Yeah.
Cafe Sacher.
I tried to get that posting.
I think it's pronounced Sacher. Yeah. It may be some fancy Austrian.
I'm a Dunkin' guy. I come from the Northeast, okay?
Is there a Dunkin' Donuts in Vienna, Austria?
I drink it regular.
Okay,
and let me tell you, the cafe coffee house product, I'm not sure how it stacks up to Dunkin' and all.
There we go, our coffee report from Vienna, Austria. So you're sitting in, Cafe Central or one of the fancy places in Vienna, and you got, say, the New York Times open, and there's a map of our material of the Middle East, 2 aircraft carriers, 42 boats, this. Can we, if we choose, apply that to deter Iranian nuclear material. Can we do that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've proven that we can inflict massive damage. But you just bringing us back to Iraq in 2003, what the military intervention there did is force capitulation. We overthrew Saddam Hussein's government, and therefore we were able to put inspectors onto the ground who were able to verify, in that case, the absence of a program. In this case, we can go with air power and bomb sites. However, and we can inflict massive damage, but we're still going to have this issue of 450 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. That's equivalent to about a dozen warheads worth, and then several thousand kilograms of lower enriched material.
Right.
And that's going to require verification, physical verification, people on the grounds accounting for that. And, God forbid that the regime actually falls before that product is verified, because if it disappears and enters into the hands of an actor that we don't know about, you've just compounded your problem.
Right.
So, military action sounds great. The U.S. obviously has a very powerful military. However, the next level of risk analysis requires a plan for how the U.S. is going to deal with the problem that military action cannot resolve.